Of the manner in which the persecutors died, by Lactantius. Part 1. The Lord has heard those supplications which you, my best beloved Donatus, pour forth in his presence all the day long, and the supplications of the rest of our brethren, who by a glorious confession have obtained an everlasting crown, the reward of their faith. Behold, all the adversaries are destroyed, and tranquility having been re-established throughout the Roman Empire, the late oppressed church arises again, and the temple of God, overthrown by the hands of the wicked, is built with more glory than before. For God has raised up princes to rescind the impious and sanguinary edicts of the tyrants, and provide for the welfare of mankind, so that now the cloud of past times is dispelled, and peace and serenity gladden all hearts. And after the furious whirlwind and black tempest, the heavens are now become calm, and the wished-for light has shone forth. And now God, the hearer of prayer, by his divine aid has lifted his prostrate and afflicted servants from the ground, has brought to an end the united devices of the wicked, and wiped off the tears from the faces of those who mourned. They who insulted over the divinity lie low. They who cast down the holy temple are fallen with more tremendous ruin, and the tormentors of just men have poured out their guilty souls amidst plagues inflicted by heaven and amidst deserved tortures. For God delayed to punish them, that by great and marvelous examples he might teach posterity that he alone is God, and that with fit vengeance he executes judgment on the proud, the impious, and the persecutors. Of the end of those men I have thought good to publish a narrative, that all who are afar off and all who shall arise hereafter may learn how the Almighty manifested his power and sovereign greatness in rooting out and utterly destroying the enemies of his name. And this will become evident when I relate who were the persecutors of the church from the time of its first constitution, and what were the punishments by which the divine judge, in his severity, took vengeance on them. In the latter days of the Emperor Tiberius, in the consulship of Ruberius Geminus and Fufius Geminus, and on the 10th of the calends of April, as I find it written, Jesus Christ was crucified by the Jews. After he had risen again on the third day, he gathered together his apostles, whom fear, at the time of his being laid hold on, had put to flight. And while he sojourned with them 40 days, he opened their hearts, interpreted to them the Scripture, which hitherto had been wrapped up in obscurity, ordained and fitted them for the preaching of his word and doctrine, and regulated all things concerning the institutions of the New Testament. And this having been accomplished, a cloud and whirlwind enveloped him and caught him up from the sight of men unto heaven. His apostles were at that time 11 in number, to whom were added Matthias in the room of the traitor Judas, and afterwards Paul. Then were they dispersed throughout all the earth to preach the gospel, as the Lord their Master had commanded them, and during 25 years, and until the beginning of the reign of the Emperor Nero, they occupied themselves in laying the foundations of the church in every province and city. And while Nero reigned, the Apostle Peter came to Rome, and through the power of God committed unto him, wrought certain miracles, and by turning many to the true religion, built up a faithful and steadfast temple unto the Lord. When Nero heard of those things, and observed that not only in Rome, but in every other place, a great multitude revolted daily from the worship of idols, and condemning their old ways, went over to the new religion, he, an execrable and pernicious tyrant, sprung forward to raise the heavenly temple and destroy the true faith. He it was who first persecuted the servants of God. He crucified Peter and slew Paul, nor did he escape with impunity. For God looked on the affliction of his people, and therefore the tyrant, bereaved of authority, and precipitated from the height of empire, suddenly disappeared, and even the burial place of that noxious wild beast was nowhere to be seen. This has led some persons of extravagant imagination to suppose that, having been conveyed to a distant region, he is still reserved alive, and to him they apply the Sibylline verses concerning the fugitive, who slew his own mother, being to come from the uttermost boundaries of the earth, as if he who was the first should also be the last persecutor, and thus prove the forerunner of Antichrist. But we ought not to believe those who, affirming that the two prophets, Enoch and Elias, have been translated into some remote place that they might attend our Lord when he shall come to judgment, also fancy that Nero is to appear hereafter as the forerunner of the devil, when he shall come to lay waste the earth and overthrow mankind. After an interval of some years from the death of Nero, there arose another tyrant, no less wicked, Domitian, who, although his government was exceedingly odious, for a very long time oppressed his subjects and reigned in security, until at length he stretched forth his impious hands against the Lord. Having been instigated by evil demons to persecute the righteous people, he was then delivered into the power of his enemies and suffered due punishment. To be murdered in his own palace was not vengeance ample enough. The very memory of his name was erased, for although he had erected many admirable edifices and rebuilt the capital and left other distinguished marks of his magnificence, yet the Senate did so persecute his name as to leave no remains of his statues or traces of the inscriptions put up in honor of him, and by most solemn and severe decrees it branded him, even after death, with perpetual infamy. Thus, the commands of the tyrant having been rescinded, the church was not only restored to her former state, but she shone forth with additional splendor and became more and more flourishing. And in the times that followed, while many well-deserving princes guided the helm of the Roman Empire, the church suffered no violent assaults from her enemies, and she extended her hands unto the east and unto the west, insomuch that now there was not any, the most remote corner of the earth, to which the divine religion had not penetrated, or any nation of manners so barbarous that did not, by being converted to the worship of God, become mild and gentle. This long peace, however, was afterwards interrupted. Decius appeared in the world, an accursed wild beast, to afflict the church, and who but a bad man would persecute religion? It seems as if he had been raised to sovereign eminence, at once to rage against God, and at once to fall. For having undertaken an expedition against the Carpi, who had then possessed themselves of Dacia and Moephia, he was suddenly surrounded by the barbarians, and slain, together with great part of his army. Nor could he be honoured with the rites of sepulture, but, stripped and naked, he lay to be devoured by wild beasts and birds, a fit end for the enemy of God. And presently Valerian also, in a mood alike frantic, lifted up his impious hands to assault God, and, although his time was short, shed much righteous blood. But God punished him in a new and extraordinary manner, that it might be a lesson to future ages that the adversaries of heaven always receive the just recompense of their iniquities. He, having been made prisoner by the Persians, lost not only that power which he had exercised without moderation, but also the liberty of which he had deprived others, and he wasted the remainder of his days in the vilest condition of slavery. For Sepphoris, the king of the Persians, who had made him prisoner, whenever he chose to get into his carriage or to mount on horseback, commanded the Roman to stoop and present his back. Then, setting his foot on the shoulders of Valerian, he said with a smile of reproach, "This is true, and not what the Romans delineate on board or plaster." Valerian lived for a considerable time under the well-merited insults of his conqueror, so that the Roman name remained long the scoff and derision of the barbarians. And this also was added to the severity of his punishment, that although he had an emperor for his son, he found no one to revenge his captivity and most abject and servile state. Neither indeed was he ever demanded back. Afterward, when he had finished this shameful life under so great dishonour, he was flayed, and his skin, stripped from the flesh, was dyed with vermilion, and placed in the temple of the gods of the barbarians, that the remembrance of a triumph so signal might be perpetuated, and that this spectacle might always be exhibited to our ambassadors, as an admonition to the Romans, that, beholding the spoils of their captive emperor in a Persian temple, they should not place too great confidence in their own strength. Now, since God so punished the sacrilegious, is it not strange that anyone should afterward have dared to do, or even to devise, anything against the majesty of the one God, who governs and supports all things? Aurelian might have recollected the fate of the captive emperor, yet, being of a nature outrageous and headstrong, he forgot both his sin and its punishment, and by deeds of cruelty irritated the divine wrath. He was not, however, permitted to accomplish what he had devised, for just as he began to give a loose to his rage, he was slain. His bloody edicts had not yet reached the more distant provinces, when he himself lay all bloody on the earth at Cenafrurium in Thrace, assassinated by his familiar friends, who had taken up groundless suspicions against him. Examples of such a nature, and so numerous, ought to have deterred succeeding tyrants. Nevertheless, they were not only not dismayed, but in their misdeeds against God, became more bold and presumptuous. While Diocletian, that author of ill and deviser of misery, was ruining all things, he could not withhold his insults, not even against God. This man, by avarice partly, and partly by timid counsels, overturned the Roman Empire. For he made choice of 3 persons to share the government with him, and thus the empire having been quartered, armies were multiplied, and each of the 4 princes strove to maintain a much more considerable military force than any sole emperor had done in times past. There began to be fewer men who paid taxes than there were who received wages, so that the means of the husbandman being exhausted by enormous impositions, the farms were abandoned, cultivated grounds became woodland, and universal dismay prevailed. Besides, the provinces were divided into minute portions, and many presidents and a multitude of inferior officers lay heavy on each territory, and almost on each city. There were also many stewards of different degrees and deputies of presidents. Very few civil causes came before them, but there were condemnations daily, and forfeitures frequently inflicted, taxes on numberless commodities, and those not only often repeated, but perpetual, and in exacting them, intolerable wrongs. Whatever was laid on for the maintenance of the soldiery might have been endured, but Diocletian, through his insatiable avarice, would never allow the sums of money in his treasury to be diminished. He was constantly heaping together extraordinary aids and free gifts, that his original hoards might remain untouched and inviolable. He also, when by various extortions he had made all things exceedingly dear, attempted by an ordinance to limit their prices. Then much blood was shed for the veriest trifles. Men were afraid to expose anything to sale, and the scarcity became more excessive and grievous than ever, until, in the end, the ordinance, after having proved destructive to multitudes, was from mere necessity abrogated. To this there were added a certain endless passion for building, and on that account endless exactions from the provinces for furnishing wages to labourers and artificers, and supplying carriages and whatever else was requisite to the works which he projected. Here public halls, there a circus, here a mint, and there a workhouse for making implements of war. in one place a habitation for his empress, and in another for his daughter. Presently great part of the city was quitted, and all men removed with their wives and children, as from a town taken by enemies. And when those buildings were completed, to the destruction of whole provinces, he said, "They are not right, let them be done on another plan." Then they were to be pulled down or altered to undergo perhaps a future demolition. By such folly was he continually endeavouring to equal Nicomedia with the city Rome in magnificence. I omit mentioning how many perished on account of their possessions or wealth, for such evils were exceedingly frequent, and through their frequency appeared almost lawful. But this was peculiar to him, that whenever he saw a field remarkably well cultivated, or a house of uncommon elegance, a false accusation and a capital punishment was straightway prepared against the proprietor, so that it seemed as if Diocletian could not be guilty of rapine without also shedding blood. What was the character of his brother in empire, Maximian, called Herculeus? Not unlike to that of Diocletian, and indeed to render their friendship so close and faithful as it was, there must have been in them a sameness of inclinations and purposes, a corresponding will and unanimity in judgment. Herein alone they were different, that Diocletian was more avaricious and less resolute, and that Maximian, with less avarice, had a bolder spirit, prone not to good, but to evil. For while he possessed Italy, itself the chief seat of empire, and while other very opulent provinces such as Africa and Spain were near at hand, he took little care to preserve those treasures which he had such fair opportunities of amassing. Whenever he stood in need of more, the richest senators were presently charged, by suborned evidences, as guilty of aspiring to the empire, so that the chief luminaries of the Senate were daily extinguished, and thus the treasury, delighting in blood, overflowed with ill-gotten wealth. Yes, add to all this the incontinency of that pestilent wretch, not only in debauching males, which is hateful and abominable, but also in the violation of the daughters of the principal men of the state, for wherever he journeyed, virgins were suddenly torn from the presence of their parents. In such enormities he placed his supreme delight, and to indulge to the utmost his lust and flagitious desires was in his judgment the felicity of his reign. I pass over Constantius, a prince unlike the others, and worthy to have had the sole government of the empire. But the other, Maximian, Galerius, chosen by Diocletian for his son-in-law, was worse not only than those two princes whom our own times have experienced, but worse than all the bad princes of former days. In this wild beast there dwelt a native barbarity and a savageness foreign to Roman blood. And no wonder, for his mother was born beyond the Danube, and it was an inroad of the Carpi that obliged her to cross over and take refuge in New Dacia. The form of Galerius corresponded with his manners, of stature tall, full of flesh, and swollen to a horrible bulk of corpulency. By his speech, gestures, and looks he made himself a terror to all that came near him. His father-in-law, too, dreaded him excessively. The cause was this: Narseus, king of the Persians, emulating the example set him by his grandfather Saporis, assembled a great army, and aimed at becoming master of the eastern provinces of the Roman Empire. Diocletian, apt to be low-spirited and timorous in every commotion, and fearing a fate like that of Valerian, would not in person encounter Narseus, but he sent Galerius by the way of Armenia, while he himself halted in the eastern provinces, and anxiously watched the event. It is a custom among the barbarians to take everything that belongs to them into the field. Galerius laid an ambush for them, and easily overthrew men embarrassed with the multitude of their followers and with their baggage. Having put Narses to flight and returned with much spoil, his own pride and Diocletian's fears were greatly increased, for after this victory he rose to such a pitch of haughtiness as to reject the appellation of Caesar. And when he heard that appellation in letters addressed to him, he cried out with a stern look and terrible voice, "How long am I to be Caesar?" Then he began to act extravagantly, insomuch that, as if he had been a second Romulus, he wished to pass for and to be called the offspring of Mars, and that he might appear the issue of a divinity, he was willing that his mother Romula should be dishonoured with the name of adulteress. But not to confound the chronological order of events, I delay the recital of his actions, for indeed afterwards, when Galerius got the title of emperor, his father-in-law having been divested of the imperial purple, he became altogether outrageous and of unbounded arrogance, while by such a conduct and with such associates, Diocles, for that was the name of Diocletian before he attained sovereignty, occupied himself in subverting the commonweal. There was no evil which his crimes did not deserve. Nevertheless, he reigned most prosperously, as long as he forbore to defile his hands with the blood of the just, and what cause he had for persecuting them I come now to explain. Diocletian, as being of a timorous disposition, was a searcher into futurity, and during his abode in the East he began to slay victims, that from their livers he might obtain a prognostic of events, and while he sacrificed, some attendants of his, who were Christians, stood by, and they put the immortal sign on their foreheads. At this the demons were chased away, and the holy rites interrupted. The soothsayers trembled, unable to investigate the wonted marks on the entrails of the victims. They frequently repeated the sacrifices, as if the former had been unpropitious. But the victims, slain from time to time, afforded no tokens for divination. At length Tages, the chief of the soothsayers, either from guess or from his own observation, said, "There are profane persons here who obstruct the rites." Then Diocletian, in furious passion, ordered not only all who were assisting at the holy ceremonies, but also all who resided within the palace, to sacrifice and, in case of their refusal, to be scourged. And further, by letters to the commanding officers, he enjoined that all soldiers should be forced to the like impiety, under pain of being dismissed the service. Thus far his rage proceeded, but at that season he did nothing more against the law and religion of God. After an interval of some time, he went to winter in Bithynia, and presently Galerius Caesar came there, inflamed with furious resentment and purposing to excite the inconsiderate old man to carry on that persecution which he had begun against the Christians. I have learned that the cause of his fury was as follows. The mother of Galerius, a woman exceedingly superstitious, was a votary of the gods of the mountains. Being of such a character, she made sacrifices almost every day, and she feasted her servants on the meat offered to idols. But the Christians of her family would not partake of those entertainments, and while she feasted with the Gentiles, they continued in fasting and prayer. On this account she conceived ill will against the Christians, and by woman-like complaints instigated her son, no less superstitious than herself, to destroy them. So during the whole winter Diocletian and Galerius held councils together, at which no one else assisted, and it was the universal opinion that their conferences respected the most momentous affairs of the empire. The old man long opposed the fury of Galerius, and showed how pernicious it would be to raise disturbances throughout the world and to shed so much blood, that the Christians were wont with eagerness to meet death, and that it would be enough for him to exclude persons of that religion from the court and the army. Yet he could not restrain the madness of that obstinate man. He resolved, therefore, to take the opinion of his friends. Now this was a circumstance in the bad disposition of Diocletian, that whenever he determined to do good, he did it without advice, that the praise might be all his own, but whenever he determined to do ill, which he was sensible would be blamed, he called in many advisers, that his own fault might be imputed to other men, and therefore a few civil magistrates and a few military commanders were admitted to give their counsel, and the question was put to them according to priority of rank. Some, through personal ill will towards the Christians, were of opinion that they ought to be cut off, as enemies of the gods and adversaries of the established religious ceremonies. Others thought differently, but having understood the will of Galerius, they, either from dread of displeasing or from a desire of gratifying him, concurred in the opinion given against the Christians. Yet not even then could the emperor be prevailed upon to yield his assent. He determined above all to consult his gods, and to that end he dispatched a soothsayer to inquire of Apollo at Miletus, whose answer was such as might be expected from an enemy of the divine religion. So Diocletian was drawn over from his purpose. But although he could struggle no longer against his friends and against Caesar and Apollo, yet still he attempted to observe such moderation as to command the business to be carried through without bloodshed, whereas Galerius would have had all persons burnt alive who refused to sacrifice. A fit and auspicious day was sought out for the accomplishment of this undertaking, and the festival of the god Terminus, celebrated on the 7th of the calends of March, was chosen in preference to all others, to terminate, as it were, the Christian religion. That day, the harbinger of death arose, first cause of ill and long-enduring woes, of woes which befell not only the Christians, but the whole earth. When that day dawned, in the 8th consulship of Diocletian and 7th of Maximian, suddenly, while it was yet hardly light, the prefect, together with chief commanders, tribunes, and officers of the treasury, came to the church in Nicomedia, and the gates having been forced open, they searched everywhere for an image of the divinity. The books of the Holy Scriptures were found, and they were committed to the flames. The utensils and furniture of the church were abandoned to pillage. All was rapine, confusion, tumult. That church, situated on rising ground, was within view of the palace, and Diocletian and Galerius stood as if on a watchtower, disputing long whether it ought to be set on fire. The sentiment of Diocletian prevailed, who dreaded lest, so great a fire being once kindled, some part of the city might he burnt, for there were many and large buildings that surrounded the church. Then the Praetorian guards came in battle array, with axes and other iron instruments, and having been let loose everywhere, they in a few hours levelled that very lofty edifice with the ground. Next day an edict was published, depriving the Christians of all honours and dignities, ordaining also that without any distinction of rank or degree they should be subjected to tortures, and that every suit at law should be received against them, while, on the other hand, they were debarred from being plaintiffs in questions of wrong, adultery, or theft, and finally, that they should neither be capable of freedom nor have right of suffrage. A certain person tore down this edict and cut it in pieces, improperly indeed, but with high spirit, saying in scorn, "These are the triumphs of Goths and Sarmatians." Having been instantly seized and brought to judgment, he was not only tortured, but burnt alive, in the forms of law. And having displayed admirable patience under sufferings, he was consumed to ashes. But Galerius, not satisfied with the tenor of the edict, sought in another way to gain on the emperor. That he might urge him to excess of cruelty and persecution, he employed private emissaries to set the palace on fire, and some part of it having been burnt, the blame was laid on the Christians as public enemies, and the very appellation of Christian grew odious on account of that fire. It was said that the Christians, in concert with the eunuchs, had plotted to destroy the princes, and that both of the princes had nearly been burnt alive in their own palace. Diocletian, shrewd and intelligent, as he always chose to appear, suspected nothing of the contrivance, but, inflamed with anger, immediately commanded that all his own domestics should be tortured to force a confession of the plot. He sat on his tribunal and saw innocent men tormented by fire to make discovery. All magistrates and all who had superintendency in the imperial palace obtained special commissions to administer the torture, and they strove with each other who should be first in bringing to light the conspiracy. No circumstances, however, of the fact were detected anywhere, for no one applied the torture to any domestics of Galerius. He himself was ever with Diocletian, constantly urging him, and never allowing the passions of the inconsiderate old man to cool. Then, after an interval of 15 days, he attempted a second fire, but that was perceived quickly and extinguished. Still, however, its author remained unknown. On that very day, Galerius, who in the middle of winter had prepared for his departure, suddenly hurried out of the city, protesting that he fled to escape being burnt alive. And now Diocletian raged, not only against his own domestics, but indiscriminately against all, and he began by forcing his daughter Valeria and his wife Prisca to be polluted by sacrificing. Eunuchs, once the most powerful, and who had chief authority at court and with the emperor, were slain. Presbyters and other officers of the church were seized, without evidence by witnesses or confession, condemned, and together with their families led to execution. In burning alive, no distinction of sex or age was regarded, and because of their great multitude, they were not burnt one after another, but a herd of them were encircled with the same fire, and servants, having millstones tied about their necks, were cast into the sea. Nor was the persecution less grievous on the rest of the people of God, for the judges, dispersed through all the temples, sought to compel everyone to sacrifice. The prisons were crowded. Tortures, hitherto unheard of, were invented. And lest justice should be inadvertently administered to a Christian, altars were placed in the courts of justice, hard by the tribunal, that every litigant might offer incense before his cause could be heard. Thus judges were no otherwise approached than divinities. Mandates also had gone to Maximian Herculius and Constantius, requiring their concurrence in the execution of the edicts. For in matters even of such mighty importance their opinion was never once asked. Herculius, a person of no merciful temper, yielded ready obedience and enforced the edicts throughout his dominions of Italy. Constantius, on the other hand, lest he should have seemed to dissent from the injunctions of his superiors, permitted the demolition of churches, mere walls, and capable of being built up again. But he preserved entire that true temple of God, which is the human body. Thus was all the earth afflicted, and from east to west, except in the territories of Gaul, 3 ravenous wild beasts continued to rage. Had I 100 mouths, 100 tongues, a voice of brass and adamantine lungs, not half the dreadful scene could I disclose, or recount the punishments inflicted by the rulers in every province on religious and innocent men. But what need of a particular recital of those things, especially to you, my best beloved Donatus, who above all others was exposed to the storm of that violent persecution. For when you had fallen into the hands of the prefect Flaccinian, no puny murderer, and afterwards of Hierocles, who from a deputy became president of Bithynia, the author and adviser of the persecution, and last of all into the hands of his successor Priscillian, you displayed to mankind a pattern of invincible magnanimity, having been 9 times exposed to racks and diversified torments. 9 times by a glorious profession of your faith you foiled the adversary. In 9 combats you subdued the devil and his chosen soldiers, and by 9 victories you triumphed over this world and its terrors. How pleasing the spectacle to God when he beheld you a conqueror, yoking in your chariot not white horses nor enormous elephants, but those very men who had led captive the nations. After this sort to lord it over the lords of the earth is triumph indeed. Now by your valour were they conquered, when you set at defiance their flagitious edicts, and, through steadfast faith and the fortitude of your soul, you routed all the vain terrors of tyrannical authority. Against you neither scourges, nor iron claws, nor fire, nor sword, nor various kinds of torture availed anything, and no violence could bereave you of your fidelity and persevering resolution. This it is to be a disciple of God, and this it is to be a soldier of Christ, a soldier whom no enemy can dislodge, or wolf snatch from the heavenly camp, no artifice ensnare, or pain of body subdue, or torments overthrow. At length, after those 9 glorious combats, in which the devil was vanquished by you, he dared not to enter the lists again with one whom, by repeated trials, he had found unconquerable, and he abstained from challenging you any more, lest you should have laid hold on the garland of victory already stretched out to you, an unfading garland, which, although you have not at present received it, is laid up in the kingdom of the Lord, for your virtue and deserts. But let us now return to the course of our narrative. The wicked plan having been carried into execution, Diocletian, whom prosperity had now abandoned, set out instantly for Rome, there to celebrate the commencement of the 20th year of his reign. That solemnity was performed on the 12th of the calends of December. And suddenly the emperor, unable to bear the Roman freedom of speech, peevishly and impatiently burst away from the city. The calends of January approached, at which day the consulship, for the 9th time, was to be offered to him. Yet rather than continue 13 days longer in Rome, he chose that his first appearance as consul should be at Ravenna. Having, however, begun his journey in winter, amidst intense cold and incessant rains, he contracted a slight but lingering disease. It harassed him without intermission, so that he was obliged, for the most part, to be carried in a litter. Then, at the close of summer, he made a circuit along the banks of the Danube, and so came to Nicomedia. His disease had now become more grievous and oppressing, yet he caused himself to be brought out, in order to dedicate that circus which, at the conclusion of the 20th year of his reign, he had erected. Immediately he grew so languid and feeble that prayers for his life were put up to all the gods. Then suddenly, on the Ides of December, there was heard in the palace sorrow and weeping and lamentation, and the courtiers ran to and fro. There was silence throughout the city, and a report went of the death, and even of the burial, of Diocletian. But early on the morrow it was suddenly rumoured that he still lived. At this the countenance of his domestics and courtiers changed from melancholy to gay. Nevertheless, there were who suspected his death to be kept secret until the arrival of Galerius Caesar, lest in the meanwhile the soldiery should attempt some change in the government. And this suspicion grew so universal that no one would believe the emperor alive until, on the calends of March, he appeared in public, but so won, his illness having lasted almost a year, as hardly to be known again. The fit of stupor, resembling death, happened on the Ides of December, and although he in some measure recovered, yet he never attained to perfect health again, for he became disordered in his judgment, being at certain times insane, and at others of sound mind. Within a few days, Galerius Caesar arrived, not to congratulate his father-in-law on the re-establishment of his health, but to force him to resign the empire. Already he had urged Maximian Herculius to the like purpose, and by the alarm of civil wars terrified the old man into compliance, and he now assailed Diocletian. At first, in gentle and friendly terms, he said that age and growing infirmities disabled Diocletian for the charge of the commonweal, and that he had need to give himself some repose after his labours. Galerius, in confirmation of his argument, produced the example of Nerva, who laid the weight of empire on Trajan, but Diocletian made answer that it was unfit for one who had held a rank eminent above all others and conspicuous to sink into the obscurity of a low station. Neither indeed was it safe, because in the course of so long a reign he must unavoidably have made many enemies. That the case of Nerva was very different. He, after having reigned a single year, felt himself, either from age or from inexperience in business, unequal to affairs so momentous, and therefore threw aside the helm of government and returned to that private life in which he had already grown old. But Diocletian added that if Galerius wished for the title of emperor, there was nothing to hinder its being conferred on him and Constantius, as well as on Maximian Herculius. Galerius, whose imagination already grasped at the whole empire, saw that little but an unsubstantial name would accrue to him from this proposal, and therefore replied that the settlement made by Diocletian himself ought to be inviolable, a settlement which provided that there should be 2 of higher rank vested with supreme power, and 2 others of inferior to assist them. Easily might concord be preserved between 2 equals, never among 4, that he, if Diocletian would not resign, must consult his own interests, so as to remain no longer in an inferior rank, and the last of that rank, that for 15 years past he had been confined as an exile to Illyricum and the banks of the Danube, perpetually struggling against barbarous nations, while others, at their ease, governed dominions more extensive than his and better civilized. Diocletian already knew by letters from Maximian Herculius all that Galerius had spoken at their conference, and also that he was augmenting his army, and now, on hearing his discourse, the spiritless old man burst into tears and said, "Be it as you will." It remained to choose Caesars by common consent. "But," said Galerius, "why ask the advice of Maximian and Constantius, since they must needs acquiesce in whatever we do?" "Certainly they will," replied Diocletian, "for we must elect their sons." Now Maximian Herculius had a son, Maxentius, married to the daughter of Galerius, a man of bad and mischievous dispositions, and so proud and stubborn withal, that he would never pay the wonted obeisance either to his father or father-in-law, and on that account he was hated by them both. Constantius also had a son, Constantine, a young man of very great worth, and well meriting the high station of Caesar. The distinguished comeliness of his figure, his strict attention to all military duties, his virtuous demeanour and singular affability, had endeared him to the troops, and made him the choice of every individual. He was then at court, having long before been created by Diocletian a tribune of the first order. "What is to be done?" said Galerius. "For that Lactantius deserves not the office, he who, while yet a private man, has treated me with contumely. How will he act when once he obtains power? But Constantine is amiable, and will so rule as hereafter, in the opinion of mankind, to surpass the mild virtues of his father. Be it so, if my inclinations and judgment are to be disregarded. Men ought to be appointed who are at my disposal, who will dread me, and never do anything unless by my orders. Whom then shall we appoint? Severus. How? That dancer, that habitual drunkard, who turns night into day and day into night. He deserves the office, for he has approved himself a faithful paymaster and purveyor of the army. And indeed I have already dispatched him to receive the purple from the hands of Maximian. Well, I consent, but whom else do you suggest? Him, said Galerius, pointing out Dia, a young man, half barbarian. Now Galerius had lately bestowed part of his own name on that youth, and called him Maximin, in like manner as Diocletian formerly bestowed on Galerius the name of Maximian for the omen's sake, because Maximian Herculeus had served him with unshaken fidelity. Who is that you present? A kinsman of mine. Alas, said Diocletian, heaving a deep sigh, you do not propose men fit for the charge of public affairs? I have tried them. Then do you look to it, who are about to assume the administration of the empire. As for me, while I continued emperor, long and diligent have been my labours in providing for the security of the commonweal, and now, should anything disastrous ensue, the blame will not be mine. Matters having been thus concerted, Diocletian and Galerius went in procession to publish the nomination of Caesars. Everyone looked at Constantine, for there was no doubt that the choice would fall on him. The troops present, as well as the chief soldiers of the other legions, who had been summoned to the solemnity, fixed their eyes on Constantine, exulted in the hope of his approaching election, and occupied themselves in prayers for his prosperity. Near 3 miles from Nicomedia there is an eminence, on the summit of which Galerius formerly received the purple, and there a pillar with the statue of Jupiter was placed. Thither the procession went. An assembly of the soldiers was called. Diocletian, with tears, harangued them, and said that he was become infirm, that he needed repose after his fatigues, and that he would resign the empire into hands more vigorous and able, and at the same time appoint new Caesars. The spectators, with the utmost earnestness, waited for the nomination. Suddenly he declared that the Caesars were Severus and Maximin. The amazement was universal. Constantine stood near in public view, and men began to question among themselves whether his name too had not been changed into Maximin, when, in the sight of all, Galerius, stretching back his hand, put Constantine aside and drew Dia forward, and, having divested him of the garb of a private person, set him in the most conspicuous place. All men wondered who he could be and from whence he came, but none ventured to interpose or move objections, so confounded were their minds at the strange and unlooked-for event. Diocletian took off his purple robe, put it on Dia, and resumed his own original name of Diocles. He descended from the tribunal and passed through Nicomedia in a chariot. And then this old emperor, like a veteran soldier freed from military service, was dismissed into his own country. While Dia, lately taken from the tending of cattle in forests to serve as a common soldier, immediately made one of the life guard, presently a tribune, and next day Caesar obtained authority to trample underfoot and oppress the empire of the East, a person ignorant alike of war and of civil affairs, and from a herdsman become a leader of armies. Galerius, having effected the expulsion of the 2 old men, began to consider himself alone as the sovereign of the Roman Empire. Necessity had required the appointment of Constantius to the first rank, but Galerius made small account of one who was of an easy temper and of health declining and precarious. He looked for the speedy death of Constantius, and although that prince should recover, it seemed not difficult to force him to put off the imperial purple. For what else could he do, if pressed by his 3 colleagues to abdicate? Galerius had Licinius ever about his person, his old and intimate acquaintance, and his earliest companion in arms, whose counsels he used in the management of all affairs. Yet he would not nominate Licinius to the dignity of Caesar with the title of son, for he purposed to nominate him in the room of Constantius to the dignity of emperor with the title of brother, while he himself might hold sovereign authority and rule over the whole globe with unbounded license. After that, he meant to have solemnized the Vicennial festival, to have conferred on his son Candidianus, then a boy of 9 years of age, the office of Caesar, and, in conclusion, to have resigned, as Diocletian had done. And thus, Licinius and Severus being emperors, and Maximin and Candidianus in the next station of Caesar's, he fancied that, environed as it were by an impregnable wall, he should lead an old age of security and peace. Such were his projects, but God, whom he had made his adversary, frustrated all those imaginations.